Thank you everyone for coming today and having a look at our interview here. Today I am joined by Paul Giblin, who is currently a Vice Consul at the US Consulate General Sydney. Prior to being at the US Consulate General in Sydney, he was a newspaper reporter and editor and columnist for 20 years. He's worked for the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Arizona Republic, among other publications, in addition to some television and radio work. So Paul and a colleague won a Puilitzer Prize for co-writing a 10-part expose on how a populist sheriff's focus on immigration enforcement endangered investigations of violent crime and other aspects of public safety. The story prompted immediate change in national immigration policies that allowed local agencies to enforce federal law. He was also part of the team that broke the story about the deadly delays and cover-ups within the Department of Veteran Affairs, which led to wide-ranging reforms. In addition, Paul spent 3 years as a civil public affairs officer for the Army in Afghanistan. And he's from Phoenix, Arizona. So welcome, Paul.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's nice to be on the show.
Thank you. So we'll just kick things off right away. Speaking about your time with Phoenix's East Valley Tribune, what led you to become a journalist with them?
I was a journalist since forever. When I was in school, all I wanted to do was become a journalist, and I worked in other places around the United States, and eventually I went to the Phoenix area where the East Valley Tribune is based, and I had a good fit over there. We had a lot of fun. At the time, the newspaper was growing. I was buying a lot of smaller newspapers, and it was an exciting time to be at a newspaper that was going through rapid growth like that.
How did working there compare with your expectations? Were you really surprised by the way that the East Valley Tribune functioned compared to other publications that you'd been with, or was it exactly as you imagined being there?
Before I got to the East Valley Tribune, I had worked at some bigger newspapers and some smaller newspapers. But the East Valley Tribune at that time was really exciting. As I said, we were growing, and we just had this huge appetite to take on more and more. And for someone like me who wanted to do that, there was a green light, and we just covered. We just acted like a big time newspaper, and I liked it. And the longer I was there, the more we grew for a while. The more we grew, and the bigger appetite we had, and we had a lot of fun.
So the next big story, of course, the Sheriff Joe series. What sparked the idea for that?
Well, at the time I was covering federal affairs, which meant I was covering the Arizona representatives in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. House. And it became apparent that immigration was bleeding into every other topic. It was bleeding into law enforcement and education and labor and every other topic you could think of. And then at that time, Joe Arpaio, the sheriff of Maricopa County, which is the county where Phoenix, Arizona is based, was getting a lot of national headlines for enforcing federal immigration law. So I thought I probably ought to pay closer attention to him. So I did. I just started showing up at his events and that sort of thing. And he would, for instance, go to a car wash or something and arrest a bunch of alleged illegal immigrants. And he'd say, "Oh, we arrested 35 suspected illegal immigrants." I said, that's great. What happened to the 40 you arrested last week? And he couldn't tell me. And that went on for some time. And the more I covered him, the more I determined that he didn't know exactly what he was doing, and that someone probably ought to find out what he was doing. So I proposed this project that we would do exactly that. We'd find out what was going on. And my colleague, a guy named Ryan Gabrielson, was covering higher education at the time, but he was really good with creating computer programs to track things. So we got him involved, and then it was kind of funny. We went to a Mexican restaurant, and I said, "Ryan, here's what I'm thinking about doing." And I laid it all out for him, and he said, "Well, that's good. We should do all those things, and we should do, this other story and this story and that story." So that's brilliant. And then we got together, and we spent 7 months reporting that story.
That's incredible, and such a long game to play on that story. I'm just going to drill down a bit on your experiences over the 7 months writing that story. What was the hardest part of that whole experience? What were some of the challenges you faced, and what surprised you the most out of that time?
Well, the part that was maybe more surprising to me was the first step. We had to gather the information. The sheriff had been conducting these immigration enforcement sweeps for 18 months. He and his men had made 669 arrests. These arrest reports varied from about 4 pages to 24 pages. So we had to go through all of those, and we had to figure out what was the information we wanted. We looked at things like where the suspected immigrants were arrested, when they were arrested, where they were going, where they were from, who they were with, how many deputies were involved, whether dogs were involved, whether helicopters were involved, whether they confiscated guns and drugs and other things. So we made these data sheets, and then we went through all 669 arrest reports, and we compiled all this on individual data sheets. And then when we had our data sheets, we went back to the newsroom and we plugged them into a computer program. That process took about 6 weeks, with 2 of us working 40 hours a day. Oh, I'm sorry, 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
So once we got that information, then we were able to look for trends, and that helped guide our reporting. And then after we did that, then we just started meeting people. We did ride-alongs with the deputies on additional patrols, and we met with civic groups, church groups, anywhere where immigrants were congregating. We started showing up to those. That was me mostly, and I've always advocated for years reporting by hanging around. So the first time you show up, no one would talk to you, and then once you start showing up for a month or two, people would talk a little bit more. So we did all that, and then we looked at the flip side. We knew that he was devoting a lot of man hours toward rounding up illegal immigrants. So we looked at what he wasn't doing, because he was taking the manpower off of other beats. And then we discovered things like rapes were going uninvestigated. There were all these rapes that simply were not investigated at all.
Did you have like an aha moment at any point where it was just like you really felt you'd hit your stride and everything was just falling together, like, you know, that big moment in the story?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is after we did the 6 months of collecting the data, we started doing these ride-alongs, and they were blatantly violating federal law, and they were doing it with us sitting in the passenger seat. They were very confident of their work, and they thought they had immunity, and they did it right in front of us. They didn't even try to hide it. So naturally, we just recorded it all and presented it all.
That must have been pretty difficult, not saying anything at the time. Personally, I'd just be there biting my tongue, just watching that unfold in those ride-alongs.
It was bizarre. You know, Ryan went separate on a ride-along. I went separate on another one. And we got back from these things, and we were just shaking our heads. The other aha moment, people found out we were doing this, so we were getting some tips. And the way law enforcement works in Arizona is most cities have their own police forces, but the smaller cities don't have their police forces, and the sheriff's office serves as the police force. Well, one particular city called Goodyear, the sheriffs were doing the police work, and then the city took over with its own police force. So we were able to get a hold of those records at the time when the sheriff was doing the police work. And we were looking through all these records, and we kept coming across all these rape reports with no investigation. And we were sitting at a table in a little room in the police office there. And I was looking at these, and I said, Ryan, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are you seeing, you know, uninvestigated rapes? He said, yeah, that's what I'm seeing too. So that was another aha moment. And then that got us on the thread of looking at rapes in particular and other crimes.
Absolutely.
It was horrible. There was one rape that happened in a ditch within throwing distance of the police substation, and it went completely uninvestigated. And it was to the point where the suspects were saying, you know, the man who raped me is named such and such, and he lives at this particular address. So naturally, we went to those addresses and knocked on the door and said, you know, is this guy here anymore? And they said, oh no, he left suddenly about a year ago. And we're like, oh, how about that?
Oh my gosh,
So those are the kinds of things we found.
Yeah, that's some really heavy things to find out, and to be able to work through as a journalist. It's really intense to go through a lot of that kind of stuff, I imagine.
It was. We kept telling our boss, we said, we're on to a pretty good story. And our boss was a guy named Chris. He was a really good guy. We said, we're on to a good story. And they said, okay, well, why don't you come in for a meeting and we'll see where you are. And then we would come in and say, oh, Chris, this is fantastic. Look what we found. We need another month. And he said, no, we need this in the paper. We said, one more month, Chris. And he said, okay, one more month. Then we come in for the next meeting. And we said, oh my goodness, look at what we found now. We need another month. And that went on for a while. And then finally Chris said, you guys will be in the paper on this particular date. And he circled it on the calendar. And we blew that deadline too, but that got us to the point where we wrapped it up.
Well, look, it was really worth it. So on that note, how did it feel when it finally ran after that mammoth effort of 7 months of just compiling all of that information?
Interestingly, I wasn't in town when the series finally ran. It ran over 5 days. And concurrent to all that, I was organizing a big camping trip for 100 boys and their fathers in the next state, New Mexico. And so we were on this 12-day camping trip. We broke into smaller groups. And I was completely out of cell phone range. We were just in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. And the series ran when I was away. And then when we finally got back to base camp days later, I called my wife, just to tell her that we were fine and everything. And she says, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe, all the national networks have been trying to reach you and all the national newspapers have been trying to reach you. And so when I finally got into town, we did some of that work.
That's incredible. That must have been just the most bizarre experience, just off for a casual camping trip and then coming back to just a media storm.
Right. We knew that we were onto a pretty good story for the local audience. We thought the story would gather some attention. We didn't really fully appreciate the national impact that it would have. So we were a little bit surprised by that.
So how was it received by the audiences?
That's a good question. It was initially received very well. The first round of readers read through it. They looked at the evidence we presented, and it was received well. A lot of people were taking a more critical look at the Sheriff Joe Arpaio. At that time, he wasn't getting a lot of critical oversight. But as time went on, the word kind of spread in different networks, I suppose, and that reaction was more negative. There was a lot of low-back people saying we were defending illegal immigration, and we said, no, it's not really about illegal immigration. It's about enforcement of immigration laws. So we'd have to redirect people and ask them if they had read the articles, and many of them hadn't. So there was a pretty split reaction, and some of the people were strong, and we heard that some people canceled their subscriptions to the newspaper. Just
on a slight shift here, this story came out at a time when obviously financial crisis just exploded. Global financial crisis, the impact in America was incredible. So how long after the story ran were you laid off by the East Valley Tribune?
The story came out in July. The newspaper had huge layoffs. They laid off half the newsroom in a single swipe. They announced the layoffs, I believe, in August or October, and then our final day at work was in January. So the story ran in July, and I wasn't working there anymore by the first week of January.
Wow. And as far as that timeline of from when the story ran and when you were laid off, with the financial crisis, the media attention on the story, how long would you say that continued throughout the rest of that year after you published it?
Well, I don't think it ever ended, because after we published, there were 3 federal investigations, one by the FBI and 2 by other agencies, into Joe Arpaio's work. And it was almost instantaneously, within, it seems like a few weeks, the federal government canceled that program that allowed local authorities like sheriff's offices to enforce federal immigration law. They just canceled it. And so that caused a ripple effect. And then that put it more in public attention as to the law enforcement side of that. And it stayed a popular topic. I believe it's still a popular topic in the United States, immigration in general and law enforcement regarding illegal immigration. I don't think that's really ever lost any momentum.
Would you say, did the story have anything to do with your being laid off from the East Valley Tribune, or was it just related to the economic downturn?
As I mentioned, half the staff got laid off on one day. When you look at everyone who contributed to that series, Ryan and myself as the writers, and then we also had photographers and graphic artists and videographers and copy editors and on and on. I counted up, there were 17 of us involved in that project. Of the 17, 16 of us were laid off that day. So I don't think the layoffs were related to that story. In fact, as I mentioned, half the staff, sports department, the business section, everyone. So it wasn't tied to that. I did a little research, and I found that from 2008 through 2009 in America, 23% of all newsroom employment has been laid off, has been cut, has been eliminated. So in 2008, there were 114,000 journalists working in America. And as of today, there's 88,000, which is a loss of 27,000 jobs.
That's incredible.
It's
it's really interesting to see how the current times with COVID-19 and the global pandemic and how the economic crisis, which evolves and is evolving from that, will potentially impact those kind of positions as well. So what I'll jump to next is, when did you find out you'd won the Pulitzer Prize, and what was your reaction?
Okay, as I said, the story ran in July.
Yeah.
My last day was January. We have been picking up some other awards, including national awards. They're usually announced starting in January. And we found out about the Pulitzer in April. And at that time, the Pulitzer Committee didn't have an event of any kind to announce it. They just put a press release online. And this is interesting. On that particular day, I was working in journalism again. And I was covering a field hearing by the U.S. Senate. Instead of meeting in Washington, they were having a meeting out in the community. It happened to be in Phoenix, and the topic happened to be immigration. And everyone who was anyone in immigration was in that room on that day, except for Joe Arpaio. He was in New York doing a segment for Comedy Central. And so I was in the front row, and my phone rang, and one of the U.S. senators gave me a dirty look and went, "Oh," I turned off my phone. I said, "Oh, that was a mistake. I should have turned it off before the meeting started." As soon as I turned it off, it rang again, and he gave me another dirty look. I went, "Oh my goodness," I turned it off. And then it rang another time right afterwards. So I thought, oh, one of my kids must be injured at school or something. Someone's trying to reach me very urgently. So I stepped out into the hallway, and as soon as I got to the hallway, it rang again. And it was a friend of mine who I'd just seen in New York, and he says, "Well, congratulations, I'll be seeing you in New York again." And I said, "Mike, why would I go to New York again?" He said, "Because you just won the Pulitzer, you moron." I said, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "I'm sure you're busy," and he hung up. And then that editor called me, and he said, "I just wanted to congratulate you. I'm sure you're getting a lot of phone calls." And I was thinking, how does Chris know Mike, and why are they, in on this joke? And then after that, it became clear that we actually had one.
Winning the Pulitzer, obviously an incredible experience. How did that influence your career trajectory?
That's a tough question. Not so much, really, I think, because I was looking for something different for a while. And I was happy to come across this story at the end, because I knew it probably would be one of my last big stories. So I was happy to do it and get involved in it. And besides, it's kind of journalism I like doing anyway. And then, so I won the Pulitzer. I didn't get the offers from the Washington Post or the New York Times, like happens in the movies. And then I went in a different direction anyway. I started a business with some of my other colleagues who were laid off, and we were doing an online news service back before that was really popular. We were right on the front edge of that. And then I had the opportunity to work for the U.S. Army as a civilian employee, essentially an in-house news reporter. So I took advantage of that, and I went to Afghanistan for 3 years, and I covered the news in Afghanistan. And then after that, I came back and I worked in the industry again. I worked for the Arizona Republic newspaper, and then I went to the State Department. So I think the Pulitzer Prize has opened doors. People take my calls, maybe. I think that's probably the biggest effect.
Touching really quickly on your time in Afghanistan, obviously there's a lot of interest in the media when they're able to see on the ground what it's like in these kind of places. Would you be able to speak a little bit to your time in Afghanistan?
Sure. I got to Afghanistan at the same time that a lot of news agencies and organizations were pulling out. They had been there for a number of years. The story didn't seem to change too much. And so the news organizations were taking people back home. There was also the big earthquake in Japan, and that caused a lot of people to leave Afghanistan and go to Japan to cover that because it was involved with a nuclear disaster as well. So anyway, I got there, and the Army wanted coverage, and they said, we need you to cover this because no one else is right now. And I said, sure, I can write news. That's not a problem. What's your distribution system? They said, well, we don't know. That's why we hired you. We want you to figure that out. I went, okay. So I had pretty good access. I had, for the most part, I had helicopters at my disposal. I had to work within the system. And if I needed to get to a different area of the country, I could do some research and figure out a helicopter when it was going and get on the helicopters. And I had good access. People were forthcoming. The Army, my experience was they wanted their story covered, and they gave me good access.
What an amazing thing to be able to witness. As a journalist, I think that's really interesting. I'll jump back a little bit just on the note of the financial crisis. So a lot of people are comparing the current economic downturn with the global pandemic to the global financial crisis. To you, who have lived through working in that environment and being laid off in that environment in America, does this current situation feel similar to you at all?
It does feel similar. In fact, it feels very similar. Before things started going south, back then I covered an economic forum, and the speaker talked about destructive creationism. And at the time, all I could see was destruction. I couldn't see any creationism. And after his presentation, I approached him. I said, where is the creationism part of this? All I'm seeing is a destruction. He says, well, that comes later. People will figure it out. And that stuck with me. And for myself, I had to reinvent what I was doing, and which I did. But it took a long time, and it was a painful process. And I look around Australia and what's happening in the United States, and I see that destruction period happening again. And I know people are despondent. They have good reason to be despondent. But I think it will lead to another period of creationism, and people will have to figure out what they're going to do next. And it's hard to do that. You work in a profession for a long time, and you are by and large defined by that profession. You define yourself by that profession. Other people define you by that profession. And then you have to just recreate everything. And it's a difficult process, and there's no clear roadmap. But I think that's the way out. At least that was my experience before. And I believe that's probably going to be the experience here at this time.
Do you feel like being a Pulitzer Prize winner, do you feel that's given you some vocational insurance, possibly, particularly in these economic times?
As I mentioned, it opens doors.
Yeah.
People take my calls. They will agree to see me, that sort of thing. But I don't think it's a guarantee of anything. I think it's yesterday's news. Quite frankly, I think it's incumbent upon everyone to prove himself or herself every day, every year, and keep current and that sort of thing. I think it's just what you're capable of doing. You did something, a long-term project with a lot of focus before. You can take that same kind of approach to the next project. And I think that's where it helps.
Just on that note, do you think that now that you've stepped away from journalism, do you find that having that experience in newsrooms, in research and all of that helps you in your current position with the consulate?
Well, it absolutely does. I'll just relate a quick story. When my last assignment was in Luanda, Angola, and I was working in the consulate section, and I noticed something that looked a little weird. Just something wasn't lining up right. So I mentioned it to my boss. I wanted to look into this a little bit further, and I, like I did with the computer program, I started tracking trends, and I marked them for a couple of months to identify some trends. And then once I was able to confirm that the trends I suspected were true, then we were able to focus a little bit deeper. And I approached that investigation much like I did the one with Joe Arpaio, just one step at a time. When I learned something, I applied that to the next step. We were able to discover something that we were able to put an end to. So
that's incredible. That's so good. And I think definitely, from what you've said and just from what I've heard from other people, just that experience in journalism allows you sense something and you're like, I'm going to follow this through to the end. So that's really fantastic to hear how it's worked for you and you've been able to.
It's a weird set of qualifications. I mean, journalism trains you to be nosy and to ask questions that polite people don't ask. And then when you find out, to tell everyone who will listen. I mean, those aren't necessarily great traits for most other jobs, but for journalism, it's pretty good. But it also tells you how to work both sides of a story. For instance, when I was doing the immigration thing, I would work with or hang out with the police, and then I would hang out with the immigrant associations. And so it gets you to work both sides and try and see the broad picture.
Just jumping back a little bit to the global financial crisis in your experience, what did you feel like you learned from that time, if anything?
The global financial crisis, nothing stays the same for very long. I think we all have to be nimble and we have to be willing to change, which is difficult. I mean, we accept that fashion changes, that music changes. We have to accept that maybe our livelihood will change as well.
So this current financial crisis has hit younger workers and people in certain industries the hardest. What advice would you give to those facing career turning points at this time, since you've had such a similar experience?
I think you have to humble yourself a little bit, and you have to come to the realization that maybe what you had been doing isn't going to be what you're going to be doing in the future. And you might have to do a little retraining or a lot of retraining. You might have to learn a foreign language, which I did. It's going to be a difficult transition in many cases, and I think people have to be prepared for that. They have to take a sober approach to that and understand there's going to be some difficult times, maybe several years of difficult times before you can turn the corner.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Paul. It's been fantastic to hear about your experience, both at the East Valley Tribune and through the global financial crisis, and how that can offer some insights to the current state of the world amidst a global pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.